Hey there, welcome to Business as Unusual. In this episode, we are diving deep with Dr. Carla Fowler. She left a medical career to become a top-notch performance and leadership coach. We'll chat about the 10-minute rule, how to thrive without burning out, and making big career pivots. Get ready for some inspiring insights.
Business as Unusual is a thought-provoking podcast that explores the innovative strategies, disruptive ideas, and unconventional practices driving successful leaders and companies in the ever-evolving world of modern business. Subscribe, comment, and share for weekly inspiration with our host, Aicila.
Hello, welcome to Business as Unusual. I'm here today with Carla. I'm very excited to introduce you all to her. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Thanks, Aicila. It's great to be here.
We're going to dive into so many different things today. And would you be willing to give people just a quick overview of what your business is and what you do?
Absolutely. So for the past 11 years, I have been running an executive coaching practice. It's called BACSA. And what I do is I work with people, typically leaders who are approaching and pursuing ambitious goals and who want to use performance science to help them. So that's what I'm up to. I work with generally 50 to 60 leaders at a time all across North America. So US and Canada, across a range of different industries. And yeah, that's what I've been up to.
I love that about consulting, that you get to peek behind it in all sorts of different industries and learn different kinds of things. What is performance science?
This is a great question. And I think of performance science as essentially all the best ideas we have about how human beings go and do challenging things successfully. And it really encompasses a lot of different fields. So it's multidisciplinary. You've got certainly the physiology, perform physical challenges more effectively. How do they run faster? How do they play better? And it evolved because there were certainly certain professions outside of the athletic realm that do have a physical component, are very sort of performance minded, like flying a plane, being in the cockpit, or being a surgeon, being in the operating room. And so those were some of the fields that, as our ideas about what went into this grew, they adopted it. And of course, those fields also have a lot of elements of decision-making and the thought elements of performance. Again, our bodies are not compartmentalized, so performance grew to also encompass, okay, well, how do our brains work best as we are trying to do these things? Whether that is make decisions in a high stress, high stakes environment, or even just how do we deal with a lot of different information? How do we deal with complexity? And then finally, of course, the business world caught up and was like, okay, well, if it's good enough for the surgeons and the pilots, why would we not be using this also? And so now I think of performance science as being this multidisciplinary bucket of ideas fed by the sociologists and the business schools, people who are really interested in strategy, execution. You could argue that the productivity field falls into this as well, but also psychology, right? All the work on mindsets and motivation. How do we get groups of people to work together on something? Culture. There's a lot of these different ideas that I would say do fall within performance science. And so that's how I think about it. And again, any field that's very complex, I often want to think about, well, how do we actually simplify that so it's usable? And so I think one of the interesting pieces of my practice and developing it has been, how do you take something really complex and make it applicable and usable to people as they're going after the goals they've set for themselves?
That is such an important skill to be able to do that. It doesn't matter how amazing something is. If you can't translate it into something understandable and actionable, it's not very useful. So, I mean, technically, I guess it's useful, but it's not usable, right?
Well said.
That's awesome. Where do you learn performance science? Like, did you study athletics or?
Great question. Because it's so multidisciplinary, there are a number of people who might be in an academic field and they've studied a piece of it. My background is actually one of the things that is sort of unique in actually coming into coaching. And that is, I've been coaching for the last 11 years, but prior to that, I was actually trained as an academic physician. So I have my MD. I went through medical school and did all that. And I have a PhD also. So I was studying the immune system. I was a very popular person during the pandemic.
Phone a friend. Your friends were very excited.
Phone a friend for questions about a global virus. And so that was my training. That was about a 9-year training program prior to heading into residency, which is what you do after medical school. And it was actually during my first year of residency as a general surgery resident at Stanford that I realized I needed to make a shift in what kind of practice was I headed towards. So was I going to continue on, do the 5 years of residency, work at an academic hospital, do research, these kinds of things. And I realized that was not as good a match for my interests as I had originally thought. And part of that was because I have always loved challenging arenas, and I really like working with people. I am fascinated by how our behavior works, what makes us tick, what allows us to do challenging things. And I was interested in that selfishly for myself, whether it was playing sports growing up or even just making it through those training programs, getting into them, making it through. And what I realized was that interest in performance was the thing for me. And I was quite successful in my training as to be a doctor and to do that. But it was not because that was the thing that was so fascinating to me. And it was much more because I was interested in how do we do challenging things successfully. And I was constantly watching my peers, trying to understand like what were the common themes. And I started to notice themes across the different arenas. For example, while I was training to do my PhD, I had a mentor who was constantly asking me, Carla, what are the questions you're trying to answer with your experiments? And why is that an important question? So yes, I hear you could run this experiment. I see that you could do that. But like, why would you do that? Why would that answer be interesting? And similarly, I could see how this idea of saying, hey, you got to figure out what really matters, not just what you can do, that idea of focus, I saw that popping up in other places. So simultaneously, I was playing Ultimate Frisbee with an elite level women's team in the Seattle area. I was trying out for the team, actually. And I was noticing that there were a number of things that went into making the team and being successful at it that had nothing to do with athletics, that had to do with like social phenomenon and were you a good fit for the role that was available on the team, not just like how good a player you were. And so there were just a number of different things that I found fascinating and relevant, and ultimately kind of traced those back to saying, okay, there is some science behind this, and there may be common principles that would be really useful if we could talk about them, really distill them, and then put them into a methodology so that whatever a leader might be pursuing, whatever kinds of goals they might be going after, they could use those. So I did not have training in performance science in a proper format. What I did have was a lot of experience in challenging arenas and a total personal passion and interest of always thinking about these things in the background. And that all added up into my decision ultimately to say, I need to run a different kind of practice. This needs to not be a medical practice. It needs to be something in the coaching arena.
That is such an interesting journey. And I'm now feeling like I should be calling you Dr. Fowler. I'm so sorry. I did not acknowledge your years of study.
Well, thank you for that. And also Carla is great for the podcast.
BACSA. Where does that come from? I imagine there's a story to the name.
There is. So BACSA means a task in Latin. And I think if you had to ask me, Carla, from your life, what is the earliest principle of performance that you like learned? I would say it's probably like as early as 5th grade, but it's this idea of, hey, when there are challenging things you want to achieve. And for me in 5th grade, it was the Presidential Physical Fitness Award. I don't know if you ever had to do that when you were in elementary school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did.
Get a patch and all, and it was different physical exercises. You had to do pull-ups and a 100-meter dash and all these things, a shuttle run. Okay, well, it was the shuttle run that totally was stumping me. And
okay,
one of the things I learned was that I had to really break that run down. So the shuttle run is where you run back and forth and you have to pick up a beanbag and then run like 10 yards, put it down, and then run back and go get another one. So you had to change directions a lot. And I really had to break it down to figure out like, oh, what's the easiest way to get low, pick up the beanbag, and then sprint back? And I lived near the elementary school and I went up there on my own to practice. Like my parents did not tell me to do this. And so BACSA means a task. And what I realized was that most big and ambitious, challenging things you want to do can be broken down into a series of the right compounding tasks that you need to do with some consistency, or that maybe it's not the same thing that you need to practice, but you need to sort of see the components of it and figure out how to line those up. But that none of the components in and of themselves need to be that complex, and they might not even be difficult. And so this was a very early principle of performance. And so that's why I named my firm after it, because I think a lot of the work I do with people is both helping them get clarity on what their goals are, but then secondly, helping them figure out, how do we break this down? What are the areas that if you focused on them as a piece of it would give you the best leverage and progress towards that goal?
I mean, that feels really true to my experience in terms of life. The more I can make it something small, I actually get overwhelmed. When I was little, it would be like, I'd look at my room and I'd be like, I can't deal with that, but I can deal with this. And I just slowly trick myself. Like that's how I said, I trick myself into cleaning everything, but just cleaning the next thing, right? Like,
yeah.
So that's why I used to do run. I used to be a distance runner. I never left the house to run 5 miles. I'd be like, I want to, but I'm just going to run to the end of the corner. Then I'll run to the next. And then by the time I was done, I'd done the 5 miles. But if I left with the idea I was doing that, it would be very burdensome. It required a lot more initiation energy for me. So it's like, no, I'm not doing that.
I call this,
I was going to go back to bed.
Yeah, I have a phrase for this, and I love the technique. And you're using a technique that I have used time and time again in different circumstances with people. I call it like the 10-minute rule. It's sort of like, okay, you don't have to run for a long time, but you need to go outside, put on your shoes and run for 10 minutes. And then if you're really not feeling it, you can go home. It's the same like when, for example, maybe a business leader needs to work on a really complex strategic task and it feels overwhelming. It feels unapproachable. And I love the 10-minute principle, which is get yourself seated, get yourself started working on it. And starting working on it could look like you've got a blank sheet of paper and you're just going to map out, well, what do I think needs to happen to pull this all together? What might be all the parts? What are some of the deadlines? Who needs to be involved? Like you could start mind mapping it, but you just set a timer and say, give it 10 minutes. And often what happens is like what you said with your run, that you get into it, you feel like you have a little momentum, it starts to feel a little bit approachable, and then you're off to the races. So
I've known a few people that have studied PhDs and for medical degrees, and deciding not to practice is actually, and to use that knowledge still is courageous. And I would say unique in terms of the false sense of ROI, right? And then obviously this is something that's been in you since you were little, since 5th grade, you were like tasks. So what is it that was inside of you? Was there a story or an inspiration, something about who you are took that moment and turned it into action that created this business?
I think some of my memories just from growing up there are 2 sides to it. One is that I think I always was very interested in, like most people, this won't sound strange, but you want to belong, you want to fit in. And one of the things I noticed was I was like, when people are good at things, like if you can accomplish some things, that seems to be helpful in that whole trying to figure out where you fit in the social fabric of things, which of course is very awkward, particularly in middle school. But I think the other thing was that as a kid, there's a lot in the world that can feel uncertain. And it turns out as an adult, there's a lot of stuff in the world that can feel uncertain. And one of the things I realized was, well, if you felt like you could approach something that was hard or difficult, and when I would have the experiences of doing that and seeing myself succeed, even when it was uncertain how it was going to turn out, that I felt a much greater sense of capability and confidence. And so one of my tools was, all right, and there's a joke in my family about this. They're like, Carla will look around and say, what's the hardest thing I can go do? And then I'll say, okay, can you make that a double? Like, I'll take 2. But part of that was because I just found it to be so empowering to watch yourself do something where failure was an option. It was not guaranteed. And I think part of the inspiration for building this practice was both to give people real tools that would help them go do those things. And that little extra confidence of not being ill-equipped when they're starting out, right? Because that's the hardest part, is committing to something, setting the goal, saying, I'm going to go do that thing. So to both have a thought partner, have someone who was in their corner, but also some real principles that they could come back to again and again. And the inspiration for that was also just because I love it when other people go do stuff that is challenging and really stretches them and makes them grow. And I think our world is a better place when we have lots of people who are willing to put themselves out there like that. And so certainly, like, leaving behind medicine, which was a clear place and where I could have had a huge impact and helped a lot of people. And, thank goodness for the number of people who do that every day and work really hard at it. And so I think in some ways leaving that's a hard thing to leave, but also I could see the passion and the characteristics that I had really made this practice the unique thing that I needed to go do, and that I thought would have a really important impact.
Yeah, I can hear that. How did people react? Were your friends surprised or supportive? Did they really want to dig in and understand? Were they curious? Like, wow, this must be, for me, it'd be like, wow, you must really be passionate to be willing to move into this. That's got to be a calling in a certain way, because you just put all of this over here. So you must really be on fire for this possibility. And I've also know sometimes people, they get scared for you. And anything that feels too personal, obviously don't share. But I'm curious how that came out for people.
Yeah. I am tremendously lucky. I have a very supportive family and also a very supportive husband. And so in the sense of often the people who are most impacted by a decision like that were very supportive. I think that it's confusing and surprising to many people. It's actually very rare for people to go through all of that and then to leave. Some people will go and they'll go into pharmaceuticals, they'll do something adjacent, but very few people make the kind of pivot into like performance and leadership coaching. But at the beginning, it's tough. I think it's tough for everyone to know what to say, because you haven't built anything yet. You have an idea, you have a passion, but I've always been a person with an idea and a passion. So I think that's always hard. And when you're starting out, it is hard when you can see a vision, but can't fully communicate it to the other people in your life. So there's a little bit of, you do have to just keep believing in it, put your head down and start to do the work to create the external results that are going to show that vision so other people can see it. And I'm now 11 years later, so over a decade. And I think what I've built is very clear. It's very clear to everyone now, and it's very clear how it is an extension of myself. But I would be lying if I said, oh yeah, like the first years were very difficult, because you have to trust yourself and believe in yourself the most, because there is the least external sort of support or proof for the thing.
Affirmation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Conveniently, you were doing performance science, so you could apply that to yourself. And I really feel that. And I think it's something entrepreneurs, I think it's good when people can share that it's, that you have to look in the mirror sometimes and say, really? Because it's kind of like the Facebook morbidity, where everybody looks like they're having a good time because that's what they're going to share. You're not going to post pictures of yourself crying. Like, most people won't even pull out a camera when that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, life is a broad spectrum of experiences, as is business. And for people to understand that you can be clearly educated, committed, driven, passionate, have an idea, have faith, confidence, and support in yourself, and still there's that extra oomph that you have to bring to it in the beginning. And to put a plug in for coaching and consulting, that's part of what we're all here for, is that you have somebody who's there to help you as you're standing on your feet, not to, you've got this. And there's a whole team of people that are here while you're figuring out the best way to wobble your bike forward, or whatever analogy you want to use.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
I know it can feel vulnerable, and I really appreciate it, because I just think it's so important for people to hear it from folks that are successful too.
Yes. Well, and particularly, I'm not doing the same thing that someone else who's listening might be doing. And that's okay. We all have to go in uncharted territory sometimes. And that can actually produce surprising and delighting results. But it does require you be willing to chart your own path.
Yeah. What does success look like to you?
Oh, great question. And this has changed, obviously, throughout my career. There was a point when it was, all right, be a transplant surgeon. But at this point, one of the things that's really important to me, for example, 11 years ago, was I wanted to build a successful business, and I wanted to be able to support myself. Like, when you leave a career path that clearly could support you, I think one of the things was I wanted to be able to support myself. And so that meant the business needed to be thriving and making money. Like, that was an important, very concrete metric. But I think the other thing is I wanted that to be sustainable, because, again, part of choosing a different path than medicine was also, I didn't want to work 100 hours. So I wanted to have really potent work that I had autonomy and control over, to think about what were the most effective and efficient ways to set up my business. What was the work I most wanted to do? I mean, coaching, as you know, and consulting are very broad fields. There are lots of different kinds of coaching you can do. You can coach groups, you can run retreats, you can facilitate, you can publicly speak. There are all these different elements of it, and even different, like, populations of clients you can choose to work with, or industries you could choose to work in. So I think I wanted it to be sustainable, and I wanted to enjoy it. I wanted to enjoy it in a way that I wanted to work until I couldn't work. So the idea of have work that I loved enough that I would never want to retire, but also work that could grow and change as I grew and changed. For example, the first 10 years of my business, I really focused and devoted it to building the business itself. So, like, basically selling things, right? Like getting clients and making sure the business was set up. And then the second big area of focus was developing my coaching methodology and really becoming a world-class coach, like really truly understanding what was the flavor of coaching and the value of that I was offering, and really just understanding it at a very deep level. And so there were a lot of things I did not do during the first 10 years. And it was a lot of just networking, really building some visibility for myself, and also working on the coaching, making sure the coaching was really like top notch. So I did no social media. I did not blog, did not do a number of the things that people are like, oh, well, you're starting a business, so you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this. And I was like, well, performance science would tell me that I have a limited number of hours in the day, and that I need to focus my energy. And in business, there is making stuff and there is selling stuff. And so I need to make sure I'm not so excited about the coaching that I'm doing no selling, that I'm not helping people know that I exist. And then on the other side, you have to make sure what you've made, the service you're offering, is really wonderful enough that when people experience it, all they want to do is tell other people about it or send a referral your way. Those were really the things that success at 10 years was to say, is the business thriving? And also, do I have a deep understanding of coaching methodology? Now, the next 10 years, I'm thinking a lot about how do I get the ideas from performance science that could be useful to anyone, and not just in a one-on-one coaching scenario. How can I get those ideas out there so that everyone can use them? And they don't have to use all of them, and they don't have to have an academic understanding of this. But if they can find one idea, like from this podcast or another podcast, or from what I post on social media, that's the next realm of success, is saying, how do I increase my impact with other people beyond the number I could coach independently? And so I think a lot about that. My last piece of success is that I've always enjoyed living a multi-channel life. So I've talked about, I love athletics. I have been interested, of course, in a lot of professional pursuits. My relationships are important to me outside of work. I feel like for me, success is not just working all the time. It's really having the ability to pursue other challenges in addition to my work challenge. So, for example, right now I am learning Portuguese, and it is really difficult. I am using a lot of performance science to keep myself going.
Nice. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Who do you typically work with? I know it's CEOs, sounds like thought leaders, or who would you say thrives with what you offer?
Yeah. Usually it would fall within that umbrella, but there are some characteristics that are common themes. Generally, it is people, and this is probably true of a lot of coaching, who have a growth mindset, right? They are interested in an outside perspective and thought partner to really learn some things that they might not know. One, I would say, unique piece of people who are particularly drawn to my practice are people who are looking for what is some outside basis for what we're going to talk about. What's the meat behind it? And this is a little bit of a departure from traditional coaching models. So a lot of the traditional schools of coaching, which I did not go to, so that's another just unique piece of going my own way, is I left medical school or my residency and ultimately started the practice, but I did not go to a formal coaching program. And there were a variety of reasons for that. But one of the benefits has been I really approached coaching from a totally different mindset. And so a traditional coaching model often teaches that, like, the client needs to find their own answers. And I am not in disagreement with the importance of a client thinking about and coming to their own answers. There are a number of things in life that don't have a best practice, and that what we really need to do in coaching is do some inquiry and some dialogue and ask some questions that help someone get to their own clarity. For example, what should their goal be, right? That's not something you can go in a book and answer. But if we think about other kinds of questions, performance science is based on the idea that there are really good answers out there for another swath of things. And so I think when people come to my practice, one of the things they're acknowledging is they want to have some dialogue and incorporate into what they do, not just their own inner wisdom, which is strong and very important to listen to, but they actually want some outside inputs. And that starts to blur the line between consulting and coaching. And again, not having come through a traditional coaching school, that was something I actually felt very comfortable with. In fact, when I asked myself what I would want from a coach, and I was probably basing this a little bit on the athletic model of coaching, which is to say, an athletic coach both has to figure out what helps any given athlete tick, what motivates them, how do they deal with struggle or challenge, where do they, when they dig deep inside themselves to pull out that next level, what works for one person might be different. And even how they train might be different. We know, for example, like distance runners, some do a lot more distance than others and use different training models because of what their bodies tolerate. So there is that element, but there are also fundamentals around physical training that a coach is also thinking about. What are the plyometrics and why do we use them? For example, what are the explosive motions that those help train? And so for me, with the coaching model, I think I both designed a model and I attract clients who are interested in that blurring of that line. And that's not to say that if there's a best practice, we just say, okay, that's the best practice, full stop, end of discussion. Best practices are often on average, but they give us a starting place to discuss and say, is this principle relevant? How might it be relevant to your situation? What else might we want to consider that might make this situation an exception? Like we should not use that principle. How comfortable are we with that? What would it look like for you to implement that principle? What are some other principles that we might want to consider in addition to this one, right? There's usually not just one, and sometimes they are competing. So we use that as a starting place, if that makes sense to do so. And then we have a really interesting discussion about it where we both bring our brains to the problem. And so again, I think for some people, they are looking for coaching that is much more focused on like really exploring inside and only like solely focusing on that inner voice, that inner wisdom. And I think in my practice, it tends to be people who are interested in doing a combination of things. So having a little bit of that, I don't know, adaptability, or maybe it's just a curiosity to say, well, I want to know what's out there. How do other people think about this?
Yeah, I find that is a great mix in terms of at least alignment in my own experience, that the combination of learning how to trust yourself is so important, especially in a world that tells us not to frequently, and also not being afraid to say, yeah, I don't know anything about that, to give me some ideas. Like I think that's a very important tension to hold, the awareness of the limits of our own knowledge and experience, while also being clear on where we need to say, no, this is where I'm going. I'm leaving the medical field. I got this. However, it's a really interesting tension to live in. But I feel like the tension between things is often where the most wisdom and insight shows up. Is there a place, a time, or a situation, obviously without breaching anything that feels confidential to you, where you saw a transformation or an aha moment that really it just was super juicy, I guess even in yourself, because you often apply these tactics to yourself, or a challenge you were working with someone where you were like, oh my gosh, this is the Hydra on every level. And yet you were able to sort of find the pathway through. Is there one of those kinds of stories or examples you can share?
Yeah, it's interesting. I often think I'm a person who thinks in themes versus stories, but one theme that's always very interesting to me, and there's an amazing amount of just different stuff that comes up in the workplace as a leader. And I think some of the most interesting places that I get to work with people are where they may need to go against the grain. They sense there's like a way of doing things, or from the culture around them. Like this could be, for example, a leader who's joined a new company and they were brought in for their expertise. And when you're noticing like, oh, everything works really differently here and differently from maybe how I might do things. And so I find it very interesting as you start to help people have the conversations to really make their impact, but in areas where, for example, it's not going to be easy. It's not like they're coming into a place where everyone is nodding yes and like, okay. Where you have to have conversations and learn and think about how to socialize an idea, how to both bring newness and change without, again, making a large group of people feel like what they've done before wasn't okay, right? So I find those kinds of situations very interesting. I would also say I love working with people and I can think of a couple of different examples of where this has come up, where, again, they have a lot of superpowers, like very good at what they do in running their business. And this has been across industries. And where what we're doing is we're actually helping them figure out, like, how do they take what they're really good at and understand where they need to put the brakes, like where they do need to understand the boundaries or where they need to put the brakes on that. It's how we let them flow with their genius while still being aware of, like, where does my genius, when I overexpress it, like kind of get me out over the edge of my skis? And what are the signs and symptoms of that? Because my goal is not to turn everyone into performance robots. It's very much to keep what makes someone unique, to let them express that and use it to the fullest of their ability. And so often we're like, okay, number one, we're not going to try and improve, and we're definitely going to try to not break the things that are really working. And so a lot of it is figuring out, what are those methodologies? For example, sometimes people, when they are highly energetic and take on a lot of projects and are really successful at that project, but then they find either that they're getting burnt out, or maybe the challenge is they start to run out of capital, right? Like the projects are all good projects, but if you start to run out of your working capital, that's a challenge also. So then, like, some of what we have to think about is, how do we sense when that point is coming? How do we think about pacing? And what are the signs and symptoms that you're going too fast? And of course, you can imagine the athletic analogy to this, of saying you often have to go out with the pack and maybe even break with the leaders, but you also have to know, how do you pace yourself so that you have energy in the tank? So those are some of the situations that I love, because again, it's not trying to get people to conform to a lot of the sort of common stereotypes of what do we think leaders are supposed to look like, and all of that, but really capitalizes on their uniqueness and then helps them use those strengths to play the game on the field. So yeah, those are things, the kinds of things that I find really interesting.
It sounds very rewarding. I think I would find that very rewarding. Share some advice that has influenced the way you approach your work.
Yes, definitely. One piece of advice I alluded to already, but I come back to it again and again, which is my PhD mentor asking me, what are the questions you're asking and what are the valuable questions to ask? And I come back to that again and again, because in coaching, I ask a lot of questions. And I think with my clients, we're always considering, we will not know the answer to most of those questions. And that can be okay if we're really focusing our time and energy on what are some of the most important ones. So that is definitely, I think that my scientific training taught me a lot about how to think about unstructured problems with a lot of uncertainty in them. So that is one piece of advice. This is, I'm not sure where this came from, and it might have been a conversation I had with someone, but I really love to think about, how do you play the games you're playing and play them to win, even if you lose, to win ultimately, even if you lose the match or you lose the round that you're in. This idea of saying, hey, if you go after big things, there's the possibility you will not be successful, but can you decide how you're going to play so that then your next play would be successful? So a great example is, often there's a lot of networking involved. There certainly was for me as I was building my practice. But a great example of this also is, if you are a startup founder and you are fundraising, you are going to need to have a lot of conversations. That's generally what it looks like. Usually you don't have like VCs knocking down your door. And so one of the things that I like to think about, or advice I give, is how can you 10x the number of conversations that you have? Like, rather than saying, okay, I think this conversation works out and this one works out, I think maybe we'll be good. But instead just say, no, I'm going to have 10x the conversations, would be a great example of playing to win, even if you lose. So it's possible you raise the money. It's possible you won't. But if you have 10x the conversations, number one, you will be super visible. Like, lots of people will know who you are. And you will also build some reputation. Someone who is willing to do insane things to go after what you want. The third piece is that you will build the muscle to go do that. That represents a lot of uncertainty, a lot of barriers and fear to get over and get comfortable with it. And you will learn both what process you have to do to get all those conversations, but also how do you get yourself to do that? And then fourth, you might be way more likely to raise the money. Hey, if you 10x your conversation, you've definitely raised the probability that you will actually raise the money you need. It's advice that I like, and there's a lot of different ways to think about it. That's just one example. But in this idea of often it's like, how can you raise the scale of whatever it is you're trying to do to set yourself up for good things, even if you don't accomplish your primary objective?
Yeah. No, there's an old saying, and I don't recall where it comes from, and it's something like the person who reaches for the stars rarely lands in the mud. And it's like that. And more the higher up, like, that motivation to leap at the very least will get you farther than if you just focused really narrowly down here. So that sounds it. And anytime you stretch, you surprise yourself, I think.
Yes.
That's observationally and experientially the world I've noticed. So what do you do to keep yourself inspired, or how do you recharge? Because I know, not just from what you said, but from working with lots of entrepreneurs and my own experience, that there are some days where you're like, I don't think so. this is not the day. And it doesn't matter. It still is the day.
Yes.
So what do you do?
Well, one thing, I love being outdoors. I love doing active things outdoors. So that is a huge source of recharging for me. Biking, hiking. I grew up in Seattle, so we love all the outdoor sports. And so that's definitely one thing. I also like having other challenges besides work, like things that I'm working on. And I think part of it is because it keeps me grounded to what my clients are experiencing, and it helps me think about performance in different ways. Like it jogs loose new ideas or ways of approaching things that I hadn't thought of before. Like Portuguese is just a great example of this. Number one, for any of my clients who are slogging through like the process of learning something that you have to do consistently over time that is really hard at the beginning, learning a language is a great parallel for that. So that is definitely a challenge I'm working on right now. And yeah. And then the other things I do is I focus a lot on kind of the physiologic elements of recharging. So I think a lot about sleep. I sleep a lot compared to average. And I know it does really good things for my brain. So that's the thing I do. The exercise is also an important piece of that physical recharge. And then I make some time to just not always have to have a purpose. So I think that's actually another really important thing is that, and this is true for many kind of highly directed, goal-oriented people, is you often need some margin and some slush time where even if you're great at going from activity A to B to C very potently and efficiently, that you actually need some time to waste 10 minutes, like waste an hour, like just do something that does not have a purpose.
The purpose can be having no purpose. For those of you that are like, I don't understand this, that's okay. I know how to trick you. You say, I have the purpose of having no purpose for the next 2 hours. You're good to go.
I like that. Good trick.
I think it's so important. Especially modern life is so interactive and not so connected. I don't know how to exactly describe it. And getting that, what I call back brain time, to be in yourself and in the world and experience what it is to feel that. There's not a good word for it that I can relay, but it changes things for you. It makes you, it also in a weird way feels like you have more time when you do that, even though it takes time. There's something about how it slows the right things down so that you can trust your decisions more and you're clear on your priorities. So all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
For folks that are listening and they want to learn more, follow you, get in touch, how do they do? What's the best way for them to do that?
So there's a couple different places. Definitely, if you're loving the conversation about performance science, want to follow along, LinkedIn's a great place to do that. So I'm often posting conversations that I've had with folks, and I also post just some ideas from performance science on there as well. So I'm at Carla-Fowler. And then My website is also a great resource. I have a lot of the podcasts I've been on are up there, but it's also a great place that you can message me. If you're interested in learning more about coaching, I've got a great FAQ section there. And again, you can get in touch there as well. So yeah, those are the best places.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
And thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you all next week. Let's see. I hope you enjoy the show. I love making it. If you did enjoy it, consider hopping over to the review portion of the platform you listen on and letting other people know about it. Or share the episode or the entire show with a friend or subscribe to the show. Definitely reach out, get on my newsletter, follow me on social media, and let me know what you like, what you don't like, and what you'd like to see in the future. Well, we love our guests. Appearance on the Business as Unusual podcast or any Bicurean consulting production is for information purposes only and is not to be considered an endorsement of their business practices, or character. Please properly vet anyone you find through this podcast and generally before you do any business with them. Thank you for listening.